All right. So my name is Da Wei Yi, or you can call me David. I'll be serving as the moderator for this session. I'm a third year SJD candidate at the UVA, where I study and write about international law and national security. I'm originally from Taipei, Taiwan, but happy to call Charlottesville my home now, given just how wonderful the place UVA is. And starting this fall, I'll also serve as a coordinator for the law science group, along with Studi and Kemi, which is an academic initiative led by US doctoral students who share an interest in exploring legal methodologies. So, while law has traditionally been viewed as distinct from the sciences, grounded primarily in doctrinal and normative analysis, our group seeks to demonstrate how scientific and interdisciplinary methods can enrich legal research and offer more systematic ways to approach complex questions. And so if you want to learn more about the project or get involved, please visit our website, join our listserv, or write to us directly. And so I'm especially excited about the opportunity to introduce Professor Cathy Hwang to all of you today, because I'm fortunate enough to be her RA and get involved in both her research and teaching for the past 3 years or so. And so, as a student, I get to testify that Professor Huang's teaching ability is just as impressive as her scholarship. Professor Huang joined the law faculty of the University of Virginia in 2020, becoming the first Asian woman to hold a tenured position at the law school. Her research and teaching focus on business law, including mergers and acquisitions, corporate contract, and corporate governance. Five of Professor Huang's articles have been voted by business law professors as among the top 10 corporate and security articles of the year. Her work has been published in numerous U.S. law reviews, including those of Cornell, Columbia, California, Pennsylvania, and here at Virginia. She is the co-author of Business Associations, A Modern Approach, published by Foundation Press in 23. In 22, Professor Huang was appointed a research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute. During the 22 to 23 school year, she was the director of the John Glenn Jr. Law and Business program at the law school. Prior to joining the Virginia faculty, Professor Huang was on the faculty of the University of Utah. She also served as an academic fellow at the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, a joint initiative of Stanford Law School and Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and as a visiting faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to academia, she practiced in the MMA group at Skadden, Arps, Slade, Meagher, and Full. So we're actually going to start with Professor Huang giving some remarks for some 25 minutes, and then she's been kind enough to take questions at the end of her presentation. At any time during that presentation, if you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, please just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can at the Q&A session. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Cathy. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. So I'm super excited to be here. Thank you to David and Simon for having me here. I see a lot of familiar names, and hopefully I'm going to encourage you to turn on your face so I can see some familiar faces as well. Our SJD students, Peter, Marilyn, and well, Peter's here twice. He's so excited to be here. And my student and RA Shankai and my student and RA Eric Nakahara are all here, and I'm sure I'm missing folks as well. I thought I saw Isabel here as well, which is one of our SJD students. So I'm very excited to be here among many people. David asked me to talk about a couple of different things. And I kind of split our chat into two sections today. So the first will be about qualitative and to some extent quantitative empirical research. And then the second part will be writing for American law reviews. At any point, just feel free to ask any questions you have by putting it in the chat. If I don't notice, I'm sure David will notice and let me know. I mean for this to be a conversation, and for us to, get something out of it and answer your questions. So let's talk first a little bit about qualitative empirical research. So I think of myself as a qualitative empirical researcher. What does that mean? That means that I'm working on on data that is non-numerical. So that might mean, for instance, interview data, which is primarily what I do, but some people do case studies or historical data as well. And this kind of research is useful when it's hard to collect numerical data. For instance, there's not enough of it. Or if your data can't be distilled into numerical analysis. For instance, if you are saying, how do most litigators think about motions to dismiss? You would initially at least have to ask them, right? Eventually, which would be qualitative. And then you maybe could say, like, 9 out of 10 litigators dislike them, or whatever it is that you're saying. Or sometimes when there's no public data available because you're working with a group that is, a company that is private, or a group that doesn't share information, or the data hasn't been made public yet. So some examples, private companies. So in my own area of research, we have public company research, but a great deal of private company information. And private companies generally don't disclose stuff to the public, at least in any sort of comparable form. So when you're doing private company research about startups or unicorns, or just like small, like family companies, sometimes you have to look at qualitative data. Transactional data that's not disclosed, small deals, or deals that are before the formal agreement is signed. Um, a fun thing I often tell people and they don't realize is that, when you're doing corporate data, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires disclosures of public companies, but that disclosure, and that's been true since like the 1930s, but only data after the mid 90s is available online. Everything else you have to file a Freedom of Information Act request for. And so sometimes it can be hard to get the old data. And finally, there are one-off or special situations. I have a student in my right now writing a paper about the US taking golden shares in companies that have national security concerns. And there's simply not enough examples of it for them to be doing any sort of quantitative analysis about that. Throughout the talk, I'm going to have these little fire emojis. And that is when I give you kind of something a little bit unconventional, and I'm calling them my hot tips. So my first hot tip is that you can, of course, mix and match between qualitative, quantitative, and other methods, even non-empirical methods. And I always encourage people to think about, what question as a researcher do you want to answer? And then to think about how best to answer that, because you're smart. You've been doing this, you've made it this far. You can learn the skills. You can learn almost any skill to answer the question that you want, but the question is to find out your research question, and then to answer questions using whatever methods you need to learn. Questions so far? Okay. So functionally, I want to talk a little bit about interview data, because I do a lot of interviews. So the first thing I want to say is when you do interview data, you always hear people talk to you about the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. Theoretically, even as students, you sometimes need to think about this, although I think there's a broad exemption for student work. So the Institutional Review Board is school specific. So if you're at Michigan, you need to be talking to Michigan's IRB. If you're at Virginia, you need to be talking to Virginia's. If you're at Stanford, you talk to Stanford, etc. So this is an on-campus office that basically reviews any research that relates to human subjects. So if you're talking about interviews, you often are also it's potentially human subject research. When you do go through the IRB for approval of your project, you do it before you start the interviews. You often have to do some online training, which is extensive and time consuming, unfortunately. Not like it'll take you a day, like a whole day. And after, you go through the process, you will either get an approval from the IRB to do your research. You'll get an exemption. They'll say, like, you don't actually need us, and they'll give you a formal exemption. Or there will be some determination that you don't need to apply for IRB research. And this, again, I've been at a few institutions now, and institutions are very different about in theory, they're kind of applying the same standard for human research, subject research, but each school kind of has a different determination, right? So for instance, when I was at Utah, I had an IRB exemption for my research. So I actually applied with some co-authors, and we wrote the process pretty broadly, and they gave us a very broad exemption that I used for a variety of projects. Um, here at Virginia, we have the law school has an internal IRB committee that they tell you to talk to before you actually talk to the university's IRB office. And it is the determination of the law school's IRB committee that I don't need to apply for IRB research for my kind of work. I've also spoken to Virginia's IRB office, and this is my next hot tip. You can call the IRB and talk to them before you actually file a formal approval for this. Um, and they can talk to you. And indeed, like if you're feeling paranoid, you can like call from your friend's office. So it says like David Yee is calling about IRB approval or whatever. Um, you can talk to them and say like, I'm planning to do research where I'm asking lawyers to tell me about the practice of litigation or whatever. And they'll tell you, I think this is or isn't something that you need to file for an IRB approval. And I have talked to Virginia's IRB office, and this is very insulting, but they said, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't think the kind of research you're doing is what we would call capital R research with a capital R. And so capital R research would be research under their definition. I forget what it is. It's something like that puts people at risk, right? Like, so I'm not like actually like, telling people to go have a fight with their partner and then like measuring how happy they are or something, or like telling people like, measuring their pain threshold or something. So like, remember the IRB review at your university is doing like, they cover it for like science, like hard science, all sorts of types of research, right? So they just don't care about what I'm doing, which is great. I love it when they don't care. It's actually really good. Um, so my hot tips for this section are you can talk to the IRB casually before you apply. And also you can talk to your department, to your associate dean, or sometimes to the committee in your law school, if you have questions about that. But it is important to think about. Second functional thing I want to talk about for interview data is how do you find interview subjects? People ask me a lot. So I'll talk actually about the second bullet first. So I do what's called snowball sampling a lot because I'm asking lawyers to talk to me about stuff that they might not want to share with a large group. So what I will say is, or they won't feel uncomfortable sharing with people. So usually what I do is I will, I'll ask Simon and I'll say like, let's talk about whatever. And then at the end, I'll say, hey, Simon, like this is a great conversation. Can you, can you introduce me to any other people who you think would like to talk about this? And he'll say, yeah, like my friend Stephanie and my friend Eric are also available to, I think I can introduce you. So you can ask at the end of your interview for recommendations from people for additional people to talk to. That's called snowball sampling. Snowball sampling has downsides. For instance, you can end up biased in one direction pretty easily. But sometimes, let's say you're doing research, you're a family law scholar, and you're doing research about polygamists, right? People who have more than one wife, which is illegal in many places. Like, it's really hard. There's no like directory of people who are polygamists. So you just got to ask, like, hey, do you know any others? And then they recommend, you and et cetera, et cetera. When you do that snowball sampling, it's really helpful to set up an email that they can forward. So for instance, I will say, hey, Simon, like, thank you. Like ask Simon at the end of our interview, he'll say, yes, like I can introduce people. And I'll say, hey, I will send an email that you can forward to your friends. So I'll write an email after and I'll say, hey, dear Simon, it was great to chat. Thank you for chatting about my project. As I mentioned, I would love additional recommendations. And then I say like what the project is, very short, and then he can forward that to his friends, and that helps to get a better return on your snowball sampling. You can also use like a formal list of whoever you're looking for, right? So if you're doing research on all people, the, OEM manufacturers of car parts, you can like, I'm sure there's a society of OEM manufacturers of car parts that you can find, and you can find a formal listing of these people, and then you can just email them all. I have found that to be a little bit less obviously, it avoids some of the bias problems that you think about with snowball sampling, but I found that to be a little bit less effective personally, because I think if people don't know you, they don't respond. And then the next slide, I want to just go through what I think of as a pile of hot tips for interviews. So just a smattering of different things that I have learned over the years, which will hopefully be helpful to you. So the first is it's very hard for people to feel like they can talk to you if they don't know you. And when you're just starting out in your career, you don't know that many people. So the snowball sampling will help, right? If you can find one person, you can find more people. But also, your school's alumni office can connect you to alums because a lot of times alums want to get involved in the school, and the alumni office will have like the big wigs, right? They'll be like, oh, like, Simon is a professor, so we want to develop a relationship with him. But we've also got some little guys, your Vanessas and Peters. Like, there are alums and we care about them, but we don't have like a great way to get them involved. We can't have them on a panel at alumni weekend or whatever. So, this is good for the alumni association to like introduce them to some professors who want to talk to them, right? They feel happy about that. Everybody wins here. And because those people are alums of your school, they will also be interested in speaking to you. Um, I find that sometimes when you're writing an email, it's really easy to want to give all the disclosure, right? To be like, I'm working on a project about people who own pets and whether they're happier. Pets can include dogs, cats, snakes, gerbils. Like you want to give them all and like you're like, oh, and I would like to speak to you for 30 minutes. I'll keep it anonymous. Like, oh my goodness, it's so much information. You want to keep it really short because these people want to imagine that they're going to talk to you for a short amount of time, help you with your research, and then be done with you. They don't want to read a whole long email. I like to keep it real short, just like one paragraph. The thing people care about most if you are doing interview data is that you are either, you know, being fair to they care that you're being fair to them, and also sometimes that you're being kind to their industry and often that you keep them anonymous. So it's helpful for you to say where you're going to report the information. So I often say, a real email I might have sent might be, I'm working on a project about term sheets in mergers and acquisitions agreements. I'd love to chat with you about your experiences. I would keep our conversation confidential, and I would report on our conversation in a law review or similar academic setting. And I would anonymize you, and then you direct them to an example. For example, I would report on you like this. If you have your own work, you can direct them to your own work. Also helps you with your SSRN download count. Just give them a link to your SSRN. But you can also direct them to me. That would help me with my SSRN count. And you can direct them to one of my papers where I report on interview data, always at the very end. So you'd say, like, I would report on it like this. And you'll see I say, like, lawyer one, Chicago, interviewed on January 8th, 2025, or something like that. And then they know you're not going to say, David Dawei Yi, a student at Virginia, has told me that he is a polygamist or something like that. That would be awkward for them. Sorry, David, I just let everyone know your secret. Um, I like to schedule interviews for 30 minutes. So when I send people a calendar invite, I set it for 30 minutes. And if they talk longer, that's fine. I don't put anything after that. So I put aside an hour in my calendar, but I only send them a calendar invite for 30 minutes so I don't scare them away. But if they talk longer, I make sure I have time to do that. You can ask many, many questions. Like when I first started, I had like 20 questions. I was like, how long have you been a lawyer? And then I write like 5 years. Like, where did you start practicing? All that stuff you can find out later, right? But you want to keep their attention on the big questions. Um, just go right into it, right? Why do you use non-binding agreements in M&A deals, even though they're such big deals? Big open-ended question. Ask the same 3 to 5 open-ended questions to every interview person, and then just type. Um, don't have lots of questions, ask a few. If you have like 2 projects that are like really related, you could do interviews for those 2 projects together, but remember, keep it really short, like 3 to 5 questions, let them talk. Don't make any promises you can't keep or that you don't want to keep. If you can't keep them anonymous, don't tell them you can keep them anonymous. Remember that when you do like an edit with a law review, the editors might ask to see your notes. They might ask who it is. You should tell them your interview candidates. I would never share your name with anyone unless the law review editors really want to see it. And even then, I would try to keep it to 1 or 2 editors. Um, I really dislike asking, letting interviewees read the paper before you publish it because I worry that sometimes they'll have thoughts and they want to give them to you and they may not be the same thoughts that you have from your research. So I generally don't offer to let them read it. I will say like, thank you so much. I'm excited to send you a published copy, and they're usually fine with that. Usually they forget that they have a talk with you. I feel like my camera is like so high. Okay, there we go. And then this is my final hot tip. Did I actually put a little fire sign? No, I forgot to put a fire sign, but this is a really big hot tip, is that when you take interviews, some people record. Um, I don't like to record my interviews because I find it just like a little bit harder to promise people that I'm going to keep it anonymous. Like I just worry about basically the data security aspects of that. Um, my spouse is a privacy scholar, so I'm a little bit paranoid about that. I don't like to record people also because sometimes when you have, the big sign that comes up in a Zoom or a phone call that's like, you are being recorded, I think that reminds them that they're being recorded and they freak out. Um, so I like to just type. I'm a very, very fast typist. I often joke that, if I was born in 1957, I'd be in the typing pool. So really, like invest in your typing speed if you're going to do this type of work. I've experimented with other things like sometimes I'll have a student come with me, like an RA come with me and just like put their face on, black out their face and I'll say like, "Oh, my RA Eric is with me and he's going to take notes." But that does change things, right? If you're talking to a lawyer, maybe they don't want to say stuff in front of a student because they want to seem cooler in front of a student. Or like they're thinking about recruiting aspects, right? They're like, oh, maybe we want Eric to come work with us in the future. So I like to just invest in my typing speed. I make it super easy. When I make I copy paste a clean copy of the questions into a Word document right at the beginning. And then anything that is a direct quote, I do in italics, and everything that's not a direct quote, I don't do in italics. I take abbreviations and then I go through later and I clean it up right after the interview. And when I say like invest in your typing speed, I mean I type like 100 words a minute. Like you just gotta type fast, and then you can get better interview data. Um, all right, let me stop there on interviews before we move on to David also asked me to talk a little bit about coding projects that I've worked on, which is more quantitative. So any questions about interview stuff? And you can ask questions later as well. Yes, Vanessa, go ahead.
So thank you very much for talking to us. I'm a big follower of your work, so I think that this preliminary introduction that you are giving us is very insightful. I just wanted to ask you if you have dealt with European type of IRB processes, because I have gone through the US for an exemption and then in Europe for the sort of ethics committee or IRB. And I would have loved to be insulted telling that my work was a non a capital R type of research. But at my previous institution, they were very much skeptical of me doing interviews for the sake of interviewing people and getting information. So have you had any type of experience about that or research unfriendly institutions that you have dealt with?
So I personally, that's a great question, Vanessa. I just did a little Google stalking while you were speaking, and I was going to say I see that you do business research at U of I, right? So if you would send me your work, I'd be happy to read it. And I also looked at your committee. I'm just a real stalker. I just did it really fast. Jeremy McLean is like one of my best friends and co-authors, and he's lovely. So anyways, sorry, this is all recorded. Everyone in the future, just yes. Vanessa is probably by then going to be a professor at Harvard. Okay, so um, I have not done European style, so I'm not sure about that. But I do think that some institutions are skeptical of interviews. So two things I would suggest. One is I would talk to the department and see what they think, right? Like I would say like, what like give me your advice about dealing with our IRB. The other thing to do is I have heard before, and I believe this was at Utah. I don't think this was at Virginia. They told me that As long as your research is asking people to no, no, this was Virginia. This is Virginia. I said my research asks people to explain their industry to me. I don't ask them for their like views of like how they feel about it. So they don't express really any personal views. They're explaining something to me. They're teaching me something. And they were like, oh, that's not capital R research. So I think about whether you can do that. And I'm always very, very careful when I ask interviewees, right? I don't say like, how do you feel when you get sued? I will say like, what does it mean for a company when they're sued? Um, because like to, I like to do what the IRB tells me. And if they tell me that I should not be asking anyone about their feelings, then I will not. I saw something in the chat. Let me just pull it up real quick. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Marilyn Hodge says, love the presentation. Thank you, Marilyn. Marilyn is a fabulous RA in person and comic. I've also been to one of her comedy shows. What has been your biggest challenge collecting qualitative data? Do you receive a lot of pushbacks from scholars who only want to do quantitative research? Okay, so also two thoughts. I have two thoughts about everything. Fun fact, I also think if you ever get into like an argument with someone, it's always good to say I have two thoughts because once you make your first argument, you always have a second argument, right? Like works at home and at work. So I have two thoughts. One is I think qualitative research, if you make a good case for why you can't do quantitative research, and sometimes you just can't yet. So earlier in my career, I did some research about letters of intent and term sheets, which are these mini agreements that you enter before an M&A, a formal M&A agreement. And I did qualitative work on it. And at the time I said, this is the only way you can do it. But recently I saw a paper where they're trying to do quantitative stuff, like gathering some like larger survey quantitative data. And that's awesome, right? Like we're just like, 10 years ago, like I think people were less excited about it. And sometimes you just need like to be able to direct people toward that earlier project and get some interest and some understanding about it. And then you can do some quantitative stuff. So I think if you justify it, you can do it. The other thing is that it's helpful to point to other scholars who you really admire, who have done really great work that do qualitative stuff. As kind of your backup. So for instance, like, in my field, like Mitu Gulati, Lisa Bernstein, or even before then, like Stuart McCauley at Wisconsin, like really incredible kind of corporate contracts people who do qualitative research, interview data, and they do it. And so I think I have a lot of cover there. So if you can point to some people whose work has really moved the ball, that can really help. But that's a great question. Okay. Other questions? I have so much more to tell you. Okay, let's just continue. Say goodbye to Calcifer, and we'll move on to the next slide. All right. So David also asked me to talk about coding projects. So I've done a couple of projects in my career, always with co-authors, where we do a huge amount of data collection, quantitative data collection. So for instance, we collected the bylaws of 30, which is think of it as like a user's manual for a company, the bylaws of the S&P 1500 companies over the last 30 years, which is like, I don't know, like 7,000 data points. I also did a project, collecting covenant data with Jeremy McLean, where we collected like 7,000 loan agreements. It's always thousands and thousands. And maybe this will become a little bit less salient as AI develops, but I will say I'm working on an M&A project right now where we're collecting M&A arbitration provisions. One of my co-authors is very bullish on having AI do this. I am very skeptical. I'm basically like afraid of technology. I'm the kind of person who like when I go to sleep, I like put my phone far away from me because I'm like, what kind of radiation am I getting from it? I don't actually think phones give you any radiation. But one of my co-authors is very bullish on using machine learning, and it just didn't work for us. Now I am coding personally thousands of M&A agreements for arbitration. And now that I see Eric's face, I'm like, maybe Eric will code thousands of M&A agreements as my RA. I don't know. Eric's gonna like turn off his face. He's like, goodbye. So how do we do this? Like, this is a really big project. So I have some tips for you. First, it's really helpful if you have a data point person, someone who hands out the assignments. I'm just going to say, candidly, some of these have been, we've been able to do that because, somebody's on sabbatical, for instance, who's able to be kind of the the kind of workhorse on this. Or sometimes we'll co-author with a postdoc who can be a workhorse on this. So you need a point person to handle assigning out data for coding. You can also promote a good RA to kind of a middle management position. So for my JDs, sometimes I get a JD after their 1L year. I often hire like 3 of them. I'll find that one is like really organized, so I'll promote them and I call them middle management. I'll give them the title senior RA. And I will promote them to the position of pointing, like parceling out documents. I will also promote them to sometimes like I call them like a help desk, like if you watch Charlie Brown, one of the peanuts will have like the psychiatrist is in, like I have them run little office hours. So what they'll do is they'll meet with all the other RAs once a week to answer questions. With these projects, a lot of times it's not so much the right answer or the wrong answer, it's being consistent with what you decide. So you read a provision and you have to decide, like, would we count this as a staggered board or not a staggered board? And if that's the case, like, if students have come across this provision and have these questions, you want to have, I had a great RA, Claire, a few years ago, and Claire would decide, are we going to count this as a staggered board or not? And then everyone would code according to what Claire says. And Claire would run the hard ones by me or someone else. You want to have regular meetings. So regular meetings could be with the RA running regular meetings or you running regular meetings. It's very tedious. It's also helpful to have a code book. So I usually do like a Google Doc where I say like, these are the 12 things we're coding for. Here are some examples. You might see this kind of provision, which you should code as yes. You might see that kind of provision, which you should code as no. You should have this kind of provision, which you should code as NA. So, we'll have different types of, we'll have like an explainer so they can go back and look at it. It's best practice to have multiple layers of checking. So having like 2 RAs check and also to like, have like a random sample of ones that you check yourself. And then my really hot tip for this is that think about whether your RAs want to work on this project. I tell all of my RAs before I hire them that they will do some of this grunt work. Every once in a while, like every other year or so, I get some real go-getter 2L who just loves to crank on coding and they're good at it, right? They'll do like 10 hours of coding for me a week for the whole school year. And I think for them, there's like, this is a good way to like make money, gain hours, and they're good at it and they'll do it. I am ashamed to say, ashamed/funny. One of my RAs a few years ago was so good at this. I literally never saw this kid. Like he came up to me at like, there was like an APALSA, like an Asian Pacific American law students event. I was talking with some of my other RAs and this guy comes up and he talks to me and then he leaves. And then I ask one of my other RAs, I'm like, who's that? And that person goes, he's so-and-so, he's your RA. And I was like, oh, never seen him before. He just like sits in a cave and codes. He's really good at it. But that was a mutually beneficial relationship, right? He was making a steady paycheck every week and doing a ton of coding, and I never saw him. But most RAs like hate this work, and so it's good to rotate them occasionally. So they'll do it for a little while, or you'll have them do it in the background for like, 5 hours a week, but you give them other stuff to do so that they don't just, come to your house and like smash your windows or something, because the work is really hard and annoying. So that's stuff I wanted to say about coding. Any questions? David, did I cover what you wanted me to say about coding? Do you have other stuff you wanted me to say?
Yeah, of course, that's very informative. And I also participated in some of the coding projects from
Yes.
Cathy. So yeah, understand. But it's very informative.
Yeah, David is still alive. He did coding. He did bylaw coding. He's fine. But apparently it left a huge impression because he was like, can you talk about bylaw coding? Any questions? I'm also happy to answer questions as you come up with these, as when you start doing stuff. Oh, I had a slide for questions. Okay. So that's kind of what I have to say about the research part. I'm going to move on to talking about writing for law reviews. But before we get there, questions about? No? Okay, let me just double check. Okay, good. So in this next section, ooh, the page flips. I didn't even realize. Oh, wow, it keeps flipping. It flips twice. That's very exciting. Can you see this? This is very exciting. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about writing for law reviews. So let me just jump right in and feel free to ask any questions you have. So what is a US Law Review? Many of you will know it's a student-edited, student-run journal. Every school has one, and we would call that the mainline journal or the flagship journal. So like the Duke Law Review, UC Irvine Law Review. These are the main law review, like the name of the school plus the words law review or law journal. Many schools have additional subject matter journals. You'll hear them called subject matter journals or secondary journals. So those are like the Virginia Journal of International Law or the William and Mary Business Law Review. So a subject matter journal. Reputationally, I more or less track the journal's ranking to be kind of similar to the law school's ranking. So Yale is the #1 law school. Maybe Stanford is right now. I don't know. But Yale would be #1 law school. Yale Law Journal would be the #1 law review, maybe. Um, if you look at data on citations and impact, which you can see in this Washington and Lee University puts out like a ranking based on citations and impact, there's going to be quite big differences there, right? So for instance, Columbia Law Review is quite influential, maybe more influential than, a higher ranked law school's law journal. But I think people don't look at the Washington and Lee citation and impact rankings as much. They kind of have anchored in their head, like Yale's a good school, so Yale's a good journal. Like Bob's Law School is a bad school, so Bob's Law School is a bad journal. They kind of have it anchored. I find that law school rankings, I would call them as traveling in groups, right? So like T14 is one group, and then good state school, like your Michigan's, Wisconsin's, Illinois, Minnesota's, I think of them as another group. And then like Bob's Law Review of horses and all these like schools you've never heard of, those are kind of another group. The secondary journals I think of as just depends on the reputation in the field. So for instance, I think, some of the really good ones in business law would be like the Harvard Business Law Review, the Columbia Business Law Review, but some other ones at really top schools just don't really rank at all. Like even ones that are better than Columbia or Harvard. Just like, if Yale has a business law review, I am not aware of it. So, just ask people in your field. And sometimes people say that just add 30 or 50 or whatever number of rankings. So, for those of you who are going out onto the job market, right? Let's say that you published in, I don't know, Virginia Journal of International Law, which is a very good international law journal. But the faculty where you're interviewing doesn't have an international law scholar. They might not know that that's like one of the best international law journals. So in their head, they're just going to be like, that's a secondary journal at Virginia. So Virginia is ranked number whatever, add 50 or add 20, whatever it is that their metric is in their own head. They'll just, it's somewhere below the main line. How much it just depends on the random person. I will say reputation of journals is really important because faculties are very heterogeneous. When you go out to interview for a job, so when David goes to interview for, this is actually both for David and Marilyn, who are both my SJD RAs. David is in national security, Marilyn's in tax. When they go out to interview for these jobs, the faculties where they're going generally don't have a national security person or a tax person. So those faculties have a hard time judging how good your work is. So, Virginia Tax Review is a very strong tax review. Florida Tax Review is also a very strong tax review. But if you're going on a faculty of people who are not tax people, they wouldn't know that necessarily that those are two of the best. When you're writing, it's helpful to think about how they select articles. So there's 2 submission seasons, February and August. And I'll make these slides available so you can read more of my details. February is where most of the articles are selected. The students will elect a new board generally. So Virginia Law Review will elect a new board. And once the new board is elected, they will start selecting articles. So that could be January 15th. It could be March 1st. It just depends on when they get to it. August, the same board that selected articles in February will select a couple more articles to kind of finish off their issues. They're often reserving space for a particular type of article. Maybe they took too many con law articles in February. They'll try to pick up like a corporate or tax or whatever in August. And people, here I have some things that people say about August. People have lots of things they say about August. The August cycle is terrible. The August cycle is dead. The August cycle is free because you can submit an article for the first time in August and then in February submit it again to a new board without changing anything. Or sometimes people say magic happens in August. So I will say I have been successful in August before. I have also not been successful in August before. You know, the August cycle is a freebie. That one is me. I usually try to write something for August. I submit it, and then if I don't get something I like, I'll try again in February. In general, you want to submit to a lot of different law reviews and trade up. So let's say you get an offer from law review number 100, you will then trade up, right? Like you'll poke the law reviews ranked above, and how far up you go to like 50 or even to Yale, that depends on how late it is in the cycle. So like if it's April 1st, you're going to tell everybody that you have an offer. If it's like February 1st, maybe you're a little conservative and you tell the next 20 law reviews up. And the way you do it is this weird thing you expedite. So you email the editors and you say, hey, I have an article. My article was accepted at Bob's Law Review for Horses, which is ranked 120. I have a deadline of next Friday. Can you review my article on an expedited basis by next Friday? And then that means that sends the signal to them that your article is good and they should read it. You don't have to accept any offers. This is not like clerkships. I do think that if you don't accept an offer, we should feel bad for the editors because they are hardworking students doing this job for free. And we should feel sorry and apologetic, but you still don't have to take it because it's your career, right? So if you get an offer you don't like, you cannot take it and feel bad about yourself and know that you're a bad person, but you still don't have to take it. These things can all be true. But you're not such a bad person that you should take a placement you're not happy with, right? This is your career, especially when you're young. Okay. Writing for law reviews, think about who your audience is. You're mostly writing for other students. I find it very useful before I submit an article to have my RAs read it because those are often very similar to the students reading the article. And I ask them what you like and what you don't like and what you don't understand. Think about writing, to people who don't know a lot about that field and what they need to know to get comfortable with it. So if I'm writing a thing about securities regulation, I might not just say, recently there have been so many enforcements of securities actions. Because remember, these are 2Ls. They might not have taken securities laws. I might say, securities enforcement is one of the most important ways that the US government gets involved in corporate law. Something bigger and more exciting. Okay, Vanessa, tell me what you're thinking. Yes,
Sorry, I'm not sure why I wasn't raising my hand, but I do have a question for law review, so
Yeah.
I think it's my time to ask it.
Yes.
So I noticed that there are many law reviews that only allow, or they would prefer to have shorter articles rather than super long articles as it was before. And I'm struggling a lot because I do have one article for the next season, which is more than 100 pages. And I was thinking about dividing it into two, but it's gonna split, the soul of the article. Like, how would you advise someone with this issue?
Split the soul of the article. Yes. Be like Voldemort, split your soul into many pieces. So I had a law school professor who told me one article, one idea. I like to say that a lot. One article, one idea. It doesn't have to be comprehensive, right? That can be your book. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. Yeah. Split the soul of the article. I have a question in the chat. Let's see what it says. Zabdi Salazar says, have you noticed any trends in which law review has been publishing more empirical work in recent years? Does that influence where you decide to submit your articles? And how do you think about whether an empirical piece fits better in a law review or a law and society journal? If you're going to do empirical stuff, that's a great question. If you're going to do empirical stuff, some of them will ask you to upload your empirical materials, like your backup and your data and whatever, which you should be prepared to do or tell them why you're not going to do it until they accept. It's hard. It's always been harder to publish empirical articles. Qualitative stuff tends to be easier for the students to understand, but I've also published quantitative stuff in law reviews, but fewer. There are law reviews that have like, more experience with that. So like, for instance, like I've published a couple of different things with Penn Law Review. I think Penn Law Review sees a lot of business law stuff. They're just a little bit more used to that. But I've also published quantitative stuff with Cornell, which doesn't generally do a lot of empirical stuff. It does not influence where I submit my articles. I just submit everywhere and then I see what I get. And an empirical piece with Law and Society or Law Review, I think, honestly, I would just submit like where you think you would get the most readership. Like there's not really such a thing as like a good fit, right? I wouldn't be like, oh, my article is a lot about, you know, companies in Boston. It's better in Boston University than in Stanford. If I get Stanford, I'm going to put it in Stanford. Like, so I think just think about who is going to be able to get the biggest readership. Marilyn asks, what advice do you have for scholars in niche fields like tax, which 2Ls hate or are scared of to get placed in flagship journals? Another really great question. So one thing I love about law is that the law review process actually forces us to constantly think about how our work relates to broader issues that are important to everybody. So if you were in science, eventually you would be writing articles about how like one atom doesn't split correctly and thus another atom doesn't split correctly and thus in theory lasers something, right? Like it'd just be very specific and nobody else would care. And you would go to conferences with 4 people. You'd be like, oh, there's 3 other people in the country who understand what I'm saying. But that's cool. That's like basic science. You're just expanding knowledge in general. But for us, we're forced through this law review process always to think about how it is that our work relates to and interests people who are generally smart. So I would always think about writing, writing to, I say an English professor, right? Like somebody who studies like Victorian era literature. Make them interested in what you're saying. Marilyn is actually very good at that. She has a couple of really interesting articles about the IRS's FAQs and also about tipping that relate to just like a huge number of people. And I will say more about that shortly. But I see that Marilyn has unmuted, which suggests to me that she wants to say something. No, it was an accident. She ran away. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so more on that. Yes, David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just a related question. So I've heard some suggest that for student-edited law reviews, it might be helpful to write maybe strong and relatively long introduction sections, since 2L editors may not have time to read through an entire piece. So I just wondering if you find that strategy effective or persuasive.
Yes, that's great. I spend a ton of time on the intro, and that's partly because of how I write. Mostly I spend like a lot of like 50% of my time on the intro, and then once I kind of nailed it down, I feel like the rest of the paper writes itself. So let me say yes, you had very good thoughts, and I'm going to support those. So when you write, think about what you do to bring what you would do in the classroom, right? So when students come into my corporations class, for instance, some of them don't know what debt is, right? So literally on the second day of class, I'll say like, debt is when you borrow money. What's a debtor? What's a creditor? Like a lender and a creditor are the same thing, like so that we're all starting on the same page. I've heard this described once in the classroom. It's like everybody get on the train. And once everyone is on the train starts going really fast, right? But we got to make sure everyone's on it. Like we can't start the train while everyone's like dangling off the side. I mean, we can, that would be funny, but hard. So I think being really clear, going step by step, explain something, explain if it is important. Say like, this is really important because, and maybe entertain them a little. I always like to start with a little story, like news story. That's fun. Keep in mind that the law review editors are incredibly busy. They're getting thousands of submissions that they are asked to make decisions on in at most 1 month, but probably more like 2 weeks. And they face an enormous amount of pressure, right? They might get something from me, and they might be like, oh, I like that. And then the very next hour, they're going to read something from Simon and they're going to be like, oh, I like that better. And then they're going to try to decide, like, am I going to take Simon's
Hello, my
paper?
friend.
I'm sorry?
think
Oh,
someone accidentally unmuted themselves.
oh. What a monster. It's okay. They were like, no, they were the best. I'm just kidding. So if Simon, if they like Simon's better, they're facing an enormous amount of pressure to be like, am I going to accept Simon's and give him 3 days? If he asks for an extension, what do I do? So they're like, they have a lot going on. So they're busy. A lot of times what they're really reading is the abstract, the intro, and maybe even the first paragraph of the intro. So make it really clear, right? Like this paper makes 2 contributions. Keep it engaged, tell them fun stories. Do what you have to do to get accepted. You can edit out the cheesier parts later, the stuff that's oversimplified. Okay, I do have a question from Pavithra. Pavithra says, thank you so much. My question might be somewhat controversial. Ooh. But I'd like to ask about the perception I've often heard. How are US law review publications generally viewed in comparison to peer-reviewed, such as international affairs, multidisciplinary studies, or development studies? I'm not a development studies person, so I'm not like the best person to ask about that, I would say. But what would I say? I think US law reviews are a generalist publication. So I think about them almost as like, the New York Times. Like people read it, there's good parts, there's bad parts. But if you were a financial person, you might be like reading the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal and think that that's better, and people in that field would know. As a young scholar, I think there's very little risk to publishing in good law reviews because everyone understands it. When you're going out for your first job or your lateral job, people will understand if you get like a, Minnesota law review. They just understand it's a good law review. That's, whereas if you have like, other publications, I would think of them as additional. That's a great question. Okay, what else did I want to say? A couple other strategic things. I know we're kind of nearing the end. Clean citations, Blue Book or similar to Blue Book, whatever citation, that journal likes, usually Blue Book. A lot of law review editors look for explanatory parentheticals. So after I cite to Marilyn's work, I might put like in a parentheses, that her paper, I'll say like exploring the impact of taxation on gig workers or something. And the reason they like these parentheticals is that a lot of law reviews have a policy that they put parentheticals after every citation. And if you don't have them, the editors look at your footnotes and they think to themselves, actually, I'm going to be the ones who's going to have to do this work. So they don't really like, they like to do as little work as possible, right? They're trying to keep their workload reasonable. I often say that you can't have too many citations or too few. People will say like 200 or 300 footnotes is about right. Keep the formatting nice, make it look like a law review article, proofread it. I was a proofreader, an academic proofreader in college. Like that was my side job. That's how I made money. And I think I'm a very good proofreader, but I also hire a proofreader. And if you want the name of my proofreader, I'm also happy to give it to you. She's very good. She's a court reporter and she's very good. So I would recommend that you hire a proofreader. Sometimes people get their RAs to proofread for them. So just get another set of eyes on it. The punchline is that students are very busy and they're looking for stuff that looks complete, that they can turnkey put to publication. Okay, questions about that? And then I have like 3 little final general pieces of advice. Okay. I have just 3 final pieces of advice for you. So, the best way to get better at writing is to read. You are, just read. Like I read a lot of fiction. I listen to audiobooks, don't just listen to podcasts, don't just read the newspaper, read art, listen to art, right? Because like we all have so little time to do that. And the law review editors are reading such boring stuff all the time. They're reading the boring reading that we give them to read for class, right? So like if they can read something that kind of excites them, that's really cool, right? So read art and try to bring some of that into your life, into your writing. The other is write like you are making a discovery, because you're making a discovery. So like, your discovery is really, really important. My parents would have loved for me to be like a scientist, like a chemist or a biologist, and I've disappointed them greatly. Um, but at least I can write as though I am doing something important. So tell the story of your paper. What happened before your paper? What conversation are you joining? Imagine your paper is like the next Harry Potter novel. Like, and you want to be able to have someone pick up Harry Potter number 4 and know, like, in the past they fought the snake and they like had the chess game, and give them some insight into what has already happened. Why are these people friends? What are you saying, right? Give them a little information. Have an arc to your paper. And the final thing is just to write in your own words, right? Like, if you're reading for fun, you'll bring, like, when you're reading for fun, right? You're reading novels, or honestly, I listen to them because I don't have, like, if I'm reading something, I just like, it's so awful, I need to stop. Like, I have no attention span anymore. If you're reading for fun, you're going to read stuff and you'll be like, oh, the writing here is terrible. Just notice what makes it terrible and then try to, write it in, bring the good parts into your own writing. So one of my co-authors introduced the word tentacular to me. So tentacular means like an octopus, like with tentacles. And I just love that word so much. So now I like try to put the word tentacular into all of my papers just for fun. Got to keep it interesting, right?
Thank you
Thank
so
Yeah.
you. Thanks
Yeah.
so
Thank
much
you
for
so
having
much.
me. It
Yeah.
was so great to have you. And anyone who has questions or follow-up questions, like, I would be delighted to chat with you afterwards, except for the person, except for the Zoom bombers. I don't want to talk to them. But everyone else, thank you so much. And it was lovely to see you. And yes, thank you so much.